Chapter 13 is the cardiovascular system. So this system consists of the heart and the vessels. And I think from chapter 11, you know what these vessels are. They're the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. But what is the function of the cardiovascular system? Transport, perhaps? So we had talked in chapter 11 about the pulmonary circuit. And that's taking deoxygenated blood, taking it to the lungs. And then the systemic circuit sends the oxygenated blood to all of the body cells. The heart is a hollow muscular pump. What cavity is it in? That would be thoracic. The average heart is 14 centimeters by 9 centimeters, and it lies in a region called the mediastinum. The mediastinum is between the lungs and under the sternum. And the apex of the heart is this part here, the end of the heart that's free. This part of the heart that's attached to the body by the great blood vessels is called the base. We have to talk about the coverings of the heart and the wall of the heart. So the coverings are pardon me, the pericardium. The pericardium has two layers. There's an outer tough layer, the fibrous pericardium, and an inner less tough, more delicate visceral pericardium that surrounds the heart. At the base of the heart, the visceral pericardium, which is right on the heart, folds back to become the parietal pericardium that lines the fibrous pericardium. And then between the parietal and visceral pericardia is a potential space, the pericardial cavity, and that's filled with serous fluid, so it is never empty. What is the innermost layer of the coverings of the heart? The visceral pericardium. Which of the descriptions of the heart is correct? D. It lies in the mediastinum and under the sternum. Which of the following is not a function of the heart? B. Production of blood cells. So you need to know all of the different parts of the heart. We'll be looking at that from different angles. Here, as you can see, the apex of the heart is pointing off to the left. So now we can tell that we are looking at the anterior surface of the heart. You can clearly see the huge aorta coming off. And then here's a vein, here's a vein. You can see where the heart is situated between the lungs on top of the diaphragm. The walls of the heart consists of three layers: epi, myo, and endocardium. The epicardium is connective tissue and epithelium, and this is where the blood vessels travel. This is the same structure as the visceral pericardium, so the innermost covering is the same as the outermost wall, so it has two different names. When you're talking about the walls of the heart, it would be epicardium. When you're talking about the coverings of the heart, it would be visceral pericardium. Myo stands for muscle, so that's the thick muscle layer, and endocardium is endothelium that lines the heart and is continuous with the blood vessels. And it contains what we'll see later to be Purkinje fibers. And so here you can see a slice through the heart, the outer fibrous pericardium, and lining that is the parietal pericardium, and then here is the visceral pericardium, which is the same as the epicardium. And then you have the thick myocardium and the very thin endocardium, smooth and slick. So how many chambers does the heart have? And how many valves does the heart have? It has 4 of each. The atria, there's a left and right atria, receive the deoxygenated blood returning to the heart. They have thin walls and these projections called auricles that look like flaps outside of them. And then we have the thicker ventricles that pump blood to the body. So there's a left and right atrium and left and right ventricle. And here they are. So we're looking at the heart anteriorly because the apex is pointing off to the left. So here is the right atrium. The deoxygenated blood comes here. Here is the left atrium. Here is the right ventricle. And here is the left ventricle. One thing you'll notice is that there's a difference in the thickness of the walls here. We'll keep going. Some new terms to learn, and I'm pointing these out just because they come up in the book, and once you understand how they make that term, then you can really understand the definition of that term. Well, septum means wall. We have a septum in our nose. It's the wall between our left and our right nasal cavities. And so in the heart, we've got septa. Atrioventricular, well, you have to remember that the atrium is this chamber and the ventricle is this chamber. So an atrioventricular septum is merely the wall between the atrium and the ventricle. An interatrial septum would be a wall between the right atrium and the left atrium. An interventricular septum is a wall between the ventricles. There are 2 valves inside the heart. Think of the phrase try before you buy, and when we follow the blood flow through the heart, we always start with the tricuspid. This is the pulmonary circuit on the right side of the heart, and here's the tricuspid valve, and here is the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid is also known as the mitral valve. You'll notice some odd kind of stringy, it looks kind of stringy here, and when you dissect a heart, it is a little bit stringy. It's just very strong, dense, regular connective tissue that forms the flaps of the valve of the heart, and it's called the chordae tendineae, and these arise from these muscles here called the papillary muscles. Which of the following is not a layer of the wall of the heart? And that would be parietal pericardium. That is a covering of the heart. Where are the AV valves located? Okay, what does AV mean? Atrioventricular. So they would be between the atria and the ventricles, D. And what do you think is the purpose of these valves? It would be the same purpose in a vein, same purpose in a water pump. The purpose is to prevent backflow. So we start with the blood flow of the heart by looking at the deoxygenated blood coming to the heart, and it gets to the heart by way of the superior vena cava and this inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava drains the whole head area and top portion of the body. The inferior vena cava drains the bottom portion of the body, and so all that used blood is going to come in here to the right atrium. You also see an opening to a coronary sinus. The heart itself has to be fed with blood. It has a tremendous oxygen requirement and nutrient requirement to keep beating. So the blood that's used within the heart itself drains into a vein in the back of the heart and then comes back in here to the right atrium by way of the coronary sinus. Again, there is a difference between the thickness of the 2 ventricles, and what what do you think the function of that difference is? What's the purpose of that difference? Well, the right atrium has thinner walls. The right ventricle, pardon me, has thinner walls. This sends blood to the lungs, not very far. The left atrium sends blood to the whole body, so it must be very strong to pump that blood out to the entire body, so it has much thicker walls. Now there are two other valves. They are not cuspid valves. The tricuspid and bicuspid are called cuspid valves. When the blood goes from the right ventricle to the lungs, it goes out this pulmonary trunk. At the base of the pulmonary trunk, and you can't see that because it's cut here, there is a valve that prevents backflow, and it's called the pulmonary valve. The aorta also has a valve. You can see part of that valve here. So as the left ventricle pumps blood out the aorta, it will not backflow back into the heart because of the aortic valve. This is a view of those aortic and pulmonary valves. They're called semilunar valves. They look a little bit like shape of a moon here, and when they are closed, they prevent backflow. You can take a slice through the heart, through this really dense connective tissue, and hit all four of these valves. It's called the skeleton of the heart, and it just has this tough, dense connective tissue just to stabilize that region. Those valves are opening and closing constantly. So we begin our blood flow with deoxygenated blood, and that deoxygenated blood is going to enter the right atrium. It's coming from the inferior vena cava and superior vena cava, as well as the coronary sinus. It drains into this right atrium, and really while it's coming into the right atrium, it's draining into the right ventricle at the same time. But then the atrium contracts and forces the remainder of the blood into the right ventricle. Then that blood is going to go out there's the pulmonary valve, go out the pulmonary trunk and the two pulmonary arteries to the lungs. It's going to return by way of 4 pulmonary veins to the left atrium, and that will then pass through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle it's going to go out the aorta to the systemic circuit. This shows just as the aorta leaves the heart, right at that little moment of the beginning of the aorta, there are two little openings off the aorta, 2 arteries, and they're the right and left coronary arteries. So those coronary arteries supply blood to the heart, and they will branch. They often have anastomosis, which is the growth of one artery connecting another one. It's like an alternate pathway in case there's blockage in one. The heart will not lose function because it can go through an alternate pathway. The more you exercise when you're younger, the better off your heart will be, because as your heart needs more and more oxygen, it will grow these anastomoses. So it's making it healthier because you're exercising. All right, now you can see how the heart, this is the anterior view of the heart, but now it's pointing off the other side. This is the posterior view of the heart. So on the posterior view of the heart, you can see this huge cardiac sinus, or coronary sinus, that the blood drains into. So this is draining the blood from the walls of the heart. Here are the coronary arteries, healthy on the left, sickly on the right. The blood flow is prevented. There may be clots or damaged arteries, but you will get death of the tissue if this is not fixed. The heart actions. The actual name for the heartbeat is the lub-dup. The first sound, the lub, is the AV valves closing. Those are the bicuspid and tricuspid. The second sound, the dup, occurs as the aortic and pulmonary valves are closing. So a lot of people don't understand that the two atria contract together and then the two ventricles contract together. So we will hear the AV valves closing first and then the semilunar valves closing next. A new word, systole and diastole. The cardiac cycle consists of the atria beating in unison. That's atrial systole, and systole is contraction, followed by the contraction of both ventricles, ventricular systole, and then the entire heart relaxes for a brief moment, diastole. So systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. I don't think these numbers are old, but they do change over time. So when your blood pressure is measured of your brachial artery, the first number, the top number, is the systolic, the contraction, and the bottom number is diastolic, the relaxation. And in the past, these people, the blood pressure of 120 over 80 might have been thought to have normal blood pressure, but now we know it's too high. You've got to have your blood pressure lower than that. This is showing the contraction of the ventricles. Now the interesting thing about heart is that the cells act independently of each other. So if you took a little mouse's heart and ground it up and grew it on nutrient agar, the cells would have their own independent beat. But as those cells start to divide and come into contact with each other, they will start to beat together. This is acting as a unit, and it's called a syncytium.